Hello and welcome to WIDA. Before we begin our program today, I want to offer a heartfelt congratulations to Jamison Greer, whose nomination to be the next United States Trade Representative was approved by the U.S. Senate yesterday. I know a lot of us in the trade community look forward to working with Jamison and the amazing team at USTR in what promises to be a very busy few months or years for those of us in the trade community. This month, we kicked off our series to review the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, and today's event dives into another central pillar of the president's agenda, reciprocal trade. Before we turn to today's event, we want to be sure you don't miss our biggest annual policy event of the year when we host the 4 Congressional Trade Councils on Friday, March 7th at the Ronald Reagan Building in Washington, D.C. That event will also be streamed, but it will not be recorded. And if you want to see that event, you either need to join us in person or watch it online to hear what the 4 trade councils from the Ways and Means and Finance committees have to say about the trade agenda. Information on that event and to find out about our USMCA review series and all our upcoming events can be found on our website, www.wita.org. As you know, if you've watched one of our webinars in the past, or many of them, we like to call out the names of some of those you're in community with in Zoom, even if you can't see them on screen. So welcome today to Elizabeth Camber with Dairy Companies Association of New Zealand, Rachel Robinson with the American International Automobile Dealers Association, Natalie Campus with Johnson & Johnson, and Ann Collett with the National Association of Manufacturers. Welcome, Elizabeth, Rachel, Natalie, and Ann, and welcome to all of you. If you're watching this on Zoom, you can ask questions of our panel using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. You should have also received a copy of today's event program by email, and that email contains a link to see all our panelists' biographies. Today's event is meant to unpack the why, what, and how the president can achieve his goal of reciprocal trade with more than 200 different countries and territories, and what that might mean for global trade and global trade rules. To do that, I'm excited to welcome today's discussants, each of whom bring a different perspective to the conversation. Mark DiPlacido, policy advisor to American Compass and a former advisor to Ambassador Lighthizer in the last Trump administration. Professor Simon Evenett, professor of geopolitics and strategy at the IMDb Business School and a leading scholar of global trade. Professor Jennifer Hillman, co-director of the Institute for International Economic Law at Georgetown University Law Center. She was also a general counsel at USTR, chair of the International Trade Commission, a judge on the appellate body of the WTO, among many other things, and is also another leading scholar of international trade. Professor John Veroneau, also senior counsel at Covington, former general counsel and deputy United States Trade Representative, and a good friend of ours. And our moderator, David Ross, partner and chair of the International Trade and Investment and Market Access Practice at WilmerHale. David is well known to many of us in the Washington, D.C. trade community from his time as counsel on the U.S. Senate Finance Committee and associate general counsel at USTR. And we're delighted he could join us to lead today's discussion with our distinguished panel. David?
Thanks, Ken. So we have a lot to discuss today, so let's just get right to it. My first question is from Mark. Mark, you worked for Ambassador Lighthizer at USTR. You're familiar with the thinking behind President Trump's reciprocal trade proposal. Can you spend a few minutes describing the issues for us?
Sure. So I guess I would start by saying I think the overall framing of the issue is that essentially the trade system that we've had for the last 30 to 80 years is not working for the United States today. And there's a need to really rethink the trade paradigm in a world where the United States is increasingly a smaller share of world GDP and is certainly not representative of 50% of world manufacturing like it was after World War II. I would say the biggest issue also, I mean, that we look at sort of the World Trade Organization as sort of the default of the last 30 years, and that system disadvantages the United States because we are the most open economy in the world. We have the lowest bound tariff rates in the world, and we also have the safest assets in the world that draws in a lot of investment, but at unfortunately the expense of our manufacturing base. And so the president and his first Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer really centered the issue around the trade deficit. And I think you see in the language in the executive order, both the day one executive order with the much longer list of trade priorities and the one specific to reciprocal tariffs. Trade deficit is really meant to anchor the purpose of the tariffs and the overall strategy of the administration. I think the U.S. trade deficit this year, I think, was the second highest it's ever been after 2022 at over $900 billion. That's over $1.2 trillion in goods, and also $300 billion in advanced technology. And a lot of people argued that the United States would keep the most competitive industries and some of the lower tech industries would flow overseas. Well, we've definitely seen highly strategic, highly systemically important industries to our economy flow overseas as well, not to mention millions of jobs and tens of thousands of factories over the last 30 years. So readjusting our economy, starting to bring back those industries and those jobs and putting the United States on better strategic footing in the year 2025, I think is maybe the way I would summarize the issue out of the gate.
Thanks for that. John, so you experienced these issues firsthand when you served as Deputy USTR and as USTR General Counsel. I mean, what do you think? Does President Trump have a point here?
To some extent, yes. Certainly in the context of reciprocity, which I think is the major focus of today's event. As we found in the Doha negotiations that failed, one of the main goals there was to address some of the non-reciprocity problems. I think the non-reciprocity problem that the president describes is not as severe as he suggests and some of his staff suggest, but it is a problem with some of our trading partners like India and Brazil. On a trade-weighted basis, reciprocity is not a huge problem, I think, among our major trading partners, especially our FTA partners. But so I do think using or threatening to use access to the U.S. market is fair to try to move forward if the goal is to reduce barriers to trade. I think one of the concerns is the reciprocity initiative is not really about trying to catalog examples of non-reciprocity so that those can be addressed and sort of pressure our trading partners to reduce those areas of non-reciprocity. I think the concern is that the cataloging of examples of reciprocity is really just to justify a Fortress America approach where we're going to increase tariffs and justify that on whatever basis is necessary. The last point I'd make is trade deficits are a macroeconomic factor and function. The trade deficit actually increased in the first Trump administration despite increasing tariffs. So I just don't think you find many economists who would link increasing tariffs with a strategy to reduce the trade deficit. A more reliable way to reduce the trade deficit would be to reduce the budget deficit, but we're going in the opposite direction in that regard. And lastly, I'd say on manufacturing output in the U.S. is near historic levels. Manufacturing jobs have declined clearly over the last 40 years, but that's a function of increased productivity. Modern factories just don't employ a lot of people, and we see the same trend in manufacturing as we saw in agriculture, where a third of Americans 100 years ago were farmers, and today about 2% of Americans are farmers. Yet the food output in America today is vastly greater than it was 100 years ago. So a similar trend in manufacturing. I think more could have been done to help communities and workers who were affected by job losses, but it's not so much a trade issue, it's a technology issue that's accounted for more than 80% of those job losses. So in sum, I think the president is correct to address some of these problems. I think it's correct not to have trade policy on autopilot, but I think some of the areas that he is focused on are misplaced.
Thanks for that, John. Jennifer, you also grappled with these issues when you served as USTR General Counsel, and as chair of the ITC. Setting aside the president's proposed solution for a moment, do you agree there's a problem?
I would agree there's a tiny problem, but I think it's more of a perception problem than a reality problem. And the perception is really based on the fact that the last time we had a big multilateral, tariff negotiation was back in the early 90s. And back in the early 90s, India had barely opened up its market. China had really not opened up its market. A number of the bigger markets were really not seriously engaged in these tariff negotiations. And so since the early 90s, the United States has not had a serious tariff negotiation with a number of these other countries. So maybe there is a time and an opportunity to do some of that, but I would totally agree with John that the president is completely overstating how kind of unfair or unbalanced the current system is. I mean, if you just look at it, the United States' trade-weighted average tariff is 2.2%. Singapore's is 0%. So there's plenty of countries that are below the United States, but even China's trade-weighted average tariff is only 3%. So to say that there's this big gap between the United States, I mean, the European Union's trade-weighted average is 2.7%. So again, yes, there's a few minor, kind of imbalances among our biggest trading partners. I mean, our biggest 3 trading partners, Mexico and Canada, 0. We all have 0. So there's no need for reciprocity. And again, with China, the difference between 3.0 and 2.2, maybe that's enough to do something. But again, I would also agree, we have to understand, why are we doing this? I mean, the idea behind reciprocity is to try to create some kind of rough balance in terms of market access to another economy. And that needs to be done, in a negotiation bilaterally. And the notion of just wholesale across the board putting new tariffs on everybody, my sense is going to be a completely impossible approach to try to get to anything resembling a rough balance. And then the last thing I'll say is I do think the president is really cherry picking. I mean, he focuses, for example, a lot on the tariff on cars, that the European Union has a tariff of 10% and we have a tariff of 2.5%. And that's his big example of how outrageous this is. And yet he doesn't remind everybody that we have a tariff of 25% on trucks. So if you look across the entire sector of sort of vehicles, our tariff is higher than Europe's. So I think we need to be really careful about accepting this myth that everybody else has really high tariffs and we don't. And somehow, therefore, we need to do this major rebalancing because everything is so unfair to the United States. I don't think that is true.
Thanks. Simon, what's the global view on the basic question and the president's suggested approach to dealing with it?
So when I talk to foreign officials, it's because they don't understand the what and the how. They sort of question the why. So on the what, I mean, the memo itself, is extremely broad and wide-ranging. It talks about measures which are written or unwritten, whether they're perceived to be unfair. It's it lacks specificity. And when you can get precise about the tariff differences, as Jennifer has highlighted, not all of them go the United States' way. I mean, the US has much higher tariffs in textiles and footwear compared to the UK, Malaysia, Japan, and Brazil, for example. So on the what, people are really unclear. On the how, the memo explicitly says the administration isn't going to choose until they get the reports. And so as a result, foreign officials don't know how to assess risk exposure and then how to respond themselves. What they are thinking about, of course, is their retaliation options. Are they going to be confined to import tariff increases? Will they go for export taxes? After all, why should the US collect tariffs to pay for tax cuts? Why not collect them from your own exporters? What about revoking the IP rights of American firms? And what about bans on outward foreign direct investment to the United States to stop those factories going to the US? So these are the types of things that people are talking about, which is more concrete, precisely because the original proposal is so vague.
Thanks, and that actually sets up the next question nicely. Turning to the proposal itself, we've been talking initially until your comment, Simon, about the tariff differentials. But the plan actually has a pretty broad scope. It covers non-reciprocal tariffs like the EU auto tariff and Brazil's tariff on ethanol. But it also includes non-tariff measures such as value-added taxes, regulatory barriers, and other unfair practices. So first, I think to Mark, is it appropriate to consider non-border measures in assessing levels of reciprocity?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is, and I think, in response to a lot of the last comments that were made, it's not just tariffs as economic policy that drive trade imbalances. There's a number of other domestic policies that drive those imbalances, and people like Lighthizer, people like Michael Pettis have done a lot of work to demonstrate that it is the surplus economies, their policies to push down consumption in their own countries to favor their own manufacturing and production that create these market distortions in the economy. So it's important to understand how reciprocity is being used here. It is not just meant to apply to tariff rates, right? And it's not to just bring the overall MFN rates down to zero for everybody. That's not at all the framework that we're working within here and that this administration is talking about. I think reciprocity is, rather than being based on tariff rates, being based on our overall trade balance with the country and recognizing all the different things that contribute to imbalances. And you're right, it is written extremely broadly. There's a line that says, these can include provisions regardless of what they're called and whether they're written or unwritten. So the administration is taking a very broad view of economic policies that affect trade, not just tariff rates.
Thanks. I actually want to send the same question now over to John. So John, what's your view on the same question of whether it's appropriate to consider non-border measures in a situation like this?
Well, to some extent, yes. I mean, the goal, the U.S. access to the U.S. market provides huge leverage, and I actually have no problem with using that as leverage to advance the interests of U.S. Exporters and U.S. businesses looking to do business overseas. So in that sense, it's okay, I think, to look at, well, what are the real barriers to trade? And taking, the WTO and the GATT is, Jennifer knows best, covers more than just tariffs. But I do think, I think the concern in the community, including the business community, is that this cataloging exercise and looking at everything that might be portrayed as a barrier to trade is going to, in a very expansive way, is really just a front for justifying increasing U.S. tariffs, and is not really a good faith effort to reduce barriers bilaterally and globally.
Thanks. Jennifer, you want to take a minute
I'll
on this?
only add that, again, the concern I would have is whether these are even remotely quantifiable. Again, John can attest to this as well. I mean, those of us that worked at USTR, annually you produce this National Trade Estimates report that is designed to look at all of the non-tariff barriers. And what you found over the long haul is this can often become a fairly pro forma exercise where you're almost cutting and pasting from the prior year's report and you send out cables and everything else. But what you get are very kind of general statements about policies that are irritating to a particular business or a particular sector. When you then go to try to say, how much is the tariff equivalent? I mean, how much did that actually cost in terms of access to the US market? That is a very, very difficult exercise, if not nigh on to an impossible exercise. So if you can't do it, if you can't really quantify it, and if you have to quantify it only kind of by sector or by HTS number, et cetera, again, it begs the question of, is this really, as John is saying, just an excuse to raise tariffs for the sake of raising tariffs? And at that point, you have to ask, then why are we doing this? Why are we raising all of these tariffs? And again, my problem is that if you think about what the Trump administration has said so far, depends on the hour or the moment what the answer to that question is. Is it to raise revenue? Is it to build a tariff wall around the United States so that everything has to be built in the United States? Is it to punish another trading partner for something that we think they've done? Is it because of fentanyl or migrants? Exactly why would we be imposing these tariffs? And again, to me, you always have to come back to, yes, it is worth imposing a tariff if there is a justification and a sense that you're going to get something that is very significantly important, but you have to understand the cost. Because there's no question it will raise prices, it will cause inflation, it will cause significant job losses in the United States. So again, is it something that is fair to ask the American people to bear a lot of pain in order to get a gain? And so I think we have to be really clear about whether imposing tariffs on non-tariff barriers, on all of these other things, will in fact result in the reduction of those non-tariff barriers so that we will in fact get more exports into those markets to compensate the American people for all of the pain and agony that the tariffs will cause. And I will just say I'm very dubious about whether this kind of tariff can produce that kind of result.
Thanks. So I'm going to come back to the logistics of this whole process in a couple of questions. We can talk about some more, but in the meantime, so Mark, as far as what's actually going to happen now, so the America First Trade Policy Memorandum directed agencies to prepare a whole variety of reports on a variety of trade issues and to deliver them to the president by April 1st. The Reciprocal Trade Memorandum states that after the agencies submit the reports, Commerce and USTR will initiate all necessary actions to investigate harm to the U.S. from other countries' non-reciprocal trade arrangements. We saw an FR notice that went out on Friday that is soliciting information to feed into this report. So what do you think this is going to mean in practice? What's going to happen once the reports are delivered to the president?
Sure. I mean, you said you would get back to, I guess, maybe the details of the laws that would be used to implement these tariffs, and I think my colleagues would probably speak better to that than me. I would just, I guess, infer, and I'm not privy to any of the conversations going on in the administration, that they seem to be going from sort of a close in proximity out approach to trade. Of course, the two countries that have dominated the conversation up to this point have really been Mexico and Canada. I think Europe will probably be next, and then China. It really seems like the president has been very quiet up until this point. I think there's probably a grander strategy going on the China front, and seemingly an effort to want to get our closest allies, whatever balance is sought on their end first, potentially next moving out to neutral countries. Again, this is speculation. And China, I think the president really appreciates that is sort of the grand problem that the United States needs to face. It was the focus of a lot of his efforts in the first administration, and like my panelists have said, the problem has continued, and there are other reasons for that. There's transshipments and cross-border production. I think a lot of the conversations, I have to imagine, with Mexico have been about keeping China out of its own market and shipping Chinese goods to the United States through China subsidized companies. There's already been progress on that front from the Mexican president, but that's when you look at that. Despite the tariffs in the first administration, despite the deals that were cut in the first administration, that our deficits with those countries, including Mexico and Canada and China, have not China, but Mexico and Canada, have increased, and the overall deficit has increased. There needs to be a wider strategy to implement these tariffs to find balance, and that's ultimately what they're about. They're not for their own sake. The president is not pro-tariff to be pro-tariff, and it's not about creating a fortress around our country and keeping other countries out. It's about recognizing we have a very serious problem with our trade balance, and a lot of that is due to other countries' policies, not just our spending.
Thanks, and I do want to pivot back to Jennifer's comments about the logistics. So what I think is going to happen here, at least in part from reading the memo and the fact sheet, is that there will be some Section 301 investigations initiated against some of these practices, probably. I mean, it seems to me from following the news that, contrary to some early expectations, and this is actually also a question that we have from the audience here, there are indications that the administration is not planning here to do a line-by-line renegotiation of tariff rates with every country, and instead it looks like what they may have in mind is that for each country under examination, whichever ones those are, the agencies will examine both tariff and non-tariff measures, try to estimate the trade effects of each, and then somehow combine that to calculate a single additional tariff for the country's products. Jennifer, you were saying a minute ago that might be impossible, and I just want to push back on that a little bit because USTR certainly has experience with differential tariffs and reducing that to a number. We know that, for example, in the USTR Section 301 investigations of digital services taxes, they quantified what they thought the trade effect of that was. I think in the case of France, for example, it was something like 1.3 billion a year or something like that. And then they came up with a potential tariff to offset that. So could you envision something like that, where you have all these discrete calculations that are kind of mushed together and then reduced to a number?
Again, I would say that is obviously clearly more feasible than what it sounded like was the original proposal. Because I mean, if you step back and think about doing this actually, trying to create reciprocal tariffs, I mean, we've got 13,000 line items in our tariff. We've got over 200 trading partners. I mean, you would end up with 2.6 million different individual tariff lines, which obviously is completely impossible to administer or anything else. I mean, if you just think about the fact that initially the president decided not to had to get rid of the waiver of the de minimis requirement for packages from China that had been subject to the $800 de minimis, because you ended up with mountains of packages sitting waiting to be cleared. You would end up with the same thing if you tried to do this 2.6 million different tariff line items. So at least trying to think about an average is arguably better. But even in your example, it's one thing to calculate an average for digital services taxes, where you know the base of the trade in digital services, you know the taxes that they're going to apply, and you can come up with it. That's really different than saying you're going to do something across all sectors, all of the economy. I mean, agriculture trades really differently than other products. Again, whatever you would then come up with would be pretty far from a really accurate number. I mean, these are going to be pretty gross averages, which again begs the question of why are we doing this if a very gross average isn't going to induce the country to do something about whatever these barriers are, because whatever the barriers are going to be averaged out to the point where the country doesn't know really what we're complaining about, because it's completely washed over by this averaging approach that we're just going to say, China, you get X percent, and India, you get Y percent. I just, again, will that actually help us reduce those particular barriers? And that's the concern that I would have by going to this sort of gross averaging.
Simon, I saw you kind of nodding your head. Do you want to comment on this too?
Yeah, sure. I mean, maybe as the economist on the panel, I should point out that this is really hard stuff to do right. Not only do we have differences between agricultural manufacturing trade, we have huge problems tracking non-tariff barriers. They're routinely information on this is very poorly collected. When we also have to figure out what are we going to do about subsidies, how are these going to be factored into calculations? They presumably affect market access calculations. And then on services trade, this is horribly measured. So I'm not sure that you would be able to come up with any type of average that would pass any serious muster, which again raises the question, why are we doing this?
So, it's interesting on this point. I don't know if folks have reviewed the notice that USTR put out on Friday soliciting the input for this process, but they do ask companies to try to quantify the effect in dollar terms and to provide a methodology. So it'll be interesting to see as submissions come in whether companies are able to do that for a lot of these measures. But so now we've heard a few times why, what is this leading to? And I have to say, I was struck when I was getting ready for this panel, reading the fact sheet, and at the last section of the fact sheet in big bold-faced type, it says the art of the international deal. And so I think that then raises the question, is this going to spur negotiations? I'm curious, Mark, do you think, for example, the administration would be willing to put U.S. tariffs and import restrictions on the table if other countries are open to lowering their barriers to U.S. exports, if this process were to trigger something like that?
Yeah, I'd say again, this is not an ideologically pro-tariff view or administration. The ultimate goal, the ultimate driving factor, and it's very explicitly stated in both the Day One executive order and the executive order on reciprocal tariffs, is achieving trade balance with other countries. The United States represents 78% of the world's trade deficit, and China represents 45% of the world's trade surplus. That is a completely unsustainable situation for our nation. It puts us at an enormous competitive disadvantage across manufacturing sectors, things that have real feed into our military, into our broader economy, into middle-class jobs. That is the ultimate driving factor here. And so if a country and the United States are able to come to an arrangement and come to a more balanced approach, that is going to be what drives these rates down. The goal is no longer the WTO framework of getting everybody to zero. That is proven to be a completely illusory goal. That is not the reality of the way the world trade has ever worked or will ever work. And I think that's been the lesson of the last 30 years, and what has created the reaction that the Trump administration represents. So there is definitely going to be a dialectic process. The president sees a wide suite of interests and issues, of course, with every country that we interact with in the world, ranging from immigration to national security to just purely economic factors. And in the president's mind, he's a negotiator on all of those fronts, and is going to keep all of those issues in mind. And of course, again, keeping in mind that China is sort of the long-term major problem and major target here. And ideally, as I think Ambassador Lighthizer laid out in a New York Times article at the beginning of February, there's a potential to move to sort of a new trading bloc that is based on this idea of balance rather than the idea of free trade for free trade's sake. And I think maybe that is the global trade regime that the United States sees as the most strategic and the most viable going forward.
Hey, John, do you have any reaction to that?
I don't, but not to put Simon on the spot, but since he's our resident economist, to the extent that a lot of the trade agenda is driven, as Mark suggests, and I think he accurately describes the situation, is to reduce the trade deficit. Every economist that I read, maybe Michael Pettis is the sole exception, says trade deficits are not a function of trade policy or unfair trade practices. They're a function of of macroeconomic factors. But Simon can certainly explain that better than I can.
David, shall I go ahead and try?
By all means.
Right. Okay. So the trade surpluses and deficits reflect the differences in the amount countries want to spend versus how much they produce. And we have in some countries a desire to spend well above their production levels, and so they import a lot and they sell assets to pay for those. And others countries do the opposite. Now you can get into a debate about what's the optimal level of consumption in a country. Some people think that China's is way too low. There's a good argument for arguing that compared to its stage of development. Other people think that a credit card crazy country which spends lots of money on goods and services consumes too much and has too high a credit deficit. But these are questions about macro policy. They are not questions about trade policy. Most people who look into these problems find that trade policy tends to distribute surpluses across bilateral partners. The actual aggregate level is determined by macro factors. And what we certainly did see in the first trade war with China in 2018 and 19 is that the US trade trade surpluses in the services started turning down the moment the trade war began. Essentially, any gain that was made on the goods side was lost on the services side. And so again, these things balance out in strange ways that don't seem to register with this particular administration.
I don't think there's anything contradictory in that statement to anything I said, and I think that's why this reciprocity executive order encompasses far more economic policies than just tariffs, right? If we're limiting trade policy to just discussions of tariffs, that is missing the larger point. And I think this administration is very aware of all of these macroeconomic factors that play a role in creating imbalances and disturbances, and are willing to address the entire suite of a country's economic policies. Obviously, the value added tax has been made. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but a lot of different macroeconomic policies that other countries are pursuing have been put on the table at this point. And there's a very real chance that instead of China lowering, tariffs or even non-tariff barriers, there need to be discussions about China's wider economic policies and the way they privilege production over consumption. I'm also not going to argue that the United States doesn't have a spending problem. I'm from a conservative organization, certainly care about the budget deficit, and recognize that political factors on the American side play a role in this discussion as well. But the question is, politically, with the authority in a democracy that we have, how do we address this problem in the best way? And how do we recognize that, how do we recognize that the middle class and the working class in our country have taken a hit from our open trade posture over the last 30 years, and do our best to make things right and to increase their economic opportunities and ultimately their sovereignty. And I would say you have a similar distortion for the middle and working class in China, right? If they are suppressing consumption, if consumption in China represents only 38% of their GDP, while it represents 68% of ours, the middle and working class in China are not reaping the rewards of their labor either. And so really you see the middle class in both countries get squeezed in the long term. And if we're selling off our assets, right, which accumulate and which pay a return in the long run, if we are selling all of those off to pay for consumption in the immediate term, that is a completely unsustainable way to run an economy.
Can I comment just really quickly? Again, I hear everything that Mark is just saying. My problem is, I agree that you're trying to go after all of these other things, but the tool that you're doing is a tariff. I mean, that's the only tool that is being talked about, is to apply tariffs on the basis, calculated, the amount of the tariff being calculated on the basis of tariffs, non-tariff barriers, all these other things. But the bottom line of what will it do in the United States is to impose a large tariff. And whatever else you can say about the tariffs, they are going to fall most heavily on low and middle income consumers, because low and middle income consumers spend on average 38% of their overall income on buying goods, as opposed to wealthy people that spend something like 11% of their income on goods. So if part of what we're trying to do is help the middle income folks in the United States, the worst thing we can do is to raise tariffs. And yet, again, fundamentally, I get it that what we need to be doing is getting the Chinese to consume more. Totally agree with that. That is absolutely a really important aspect of this, is that China does not consume enough. But the question is, why would our imposing high tariffs cause China to change their policy in order to encourage more consumption in China? That's, again, the kind of disconnect that at least I don't think is clear from this idea of these reciprocal tariffs.
So Mark touched on the VAT issue, and there's actually a question from the audience on the inclusion of VAT in the offset calculation. I don't want to go too far into this because, as you said, it's very complicated. The basic issue has to do with the fact that VAT taxes can, under WTO rules, can be rebated on export, and U.S. doesn't have a VAT; it has a corporate income tax. That kind of direct tax can't be. This all goes back to the 1960s, and then the Fisk ETI cases in the early part of the century. But so my question is to Simon. If we just stipulate that VAT is going to be part of this discussion, what's your view on how that could be reduced to a number that can be made into part of a tariff?
I guess I would challenge the premise, because most of the economic research in this area shows that if you put a VAT in place which is too high, the currency moves to offset it. So the adjustments already happened in the markets. So I think that would be the sort of if I've understood their argument right, the sort of Gene Grossman Princeton University view of this, which is that essentially the market's already adjusted to this. So we don't know why this issue is being raised. That would be one thing. The other thing to say is, I mean, let's just turn this around. If a foreign country came to the United States and told it how to exercise its sovereign right to collect taxation, how quickly would that country representatives be shown to the door? I don't think this is going to fly.
Okay, well, we'll leave that and move on. John, one thing that's been interesting about this whole process is there hasn't been yet much involvement by Congress. And so I guess my question to you is there a role here for Congress, or does the president have authority to do everything he's talking about already?
Well, the president obviously has authority to engage with trading partners and have discussions. The role for Congress, I think, is obviously an open question, which some of us who have been around for a while find very interesting. Congress historically has been very aggressive and assertive in reminding the executive branch of Congress's primary constitutional role in tariff setting, and I've found Congress's silence to be quite interesting and quite opposite of what its posture historically when considering free trade agreements, et cetera, et cetera. But Congress needs to be involved, certainly if these negotiations involve U.S. barriers being put on the table, and that's obviously an open question. Then Congress would have to be involved in changing any U.S. tariffs, lowering tariffs, other import restrictions that Congress put in place. Congress would have to play a role in changing those. But even aside from that, if we're just talking about raising U.S. tariffs in response to non-reciprocity of trading partners, I do not believe Congress ever delegated to the executive branch such broad tariff rewriting authority. Section 301, Section 232, Section 338, these are very discrete statutory delegations authorizing the president to increase tariffs in response to very specific circumstances, statutorily defined determinations that have to be met. I just don't think it's credible to argue that any of those statutes provide the president with authority to establish 200 new columns in the U.S. tariff schedule.
So it seems if this goes forward, we might see some more case law being made over the next couple of years. Jennifer, I want to ask you, setting aside, whether you agree with this whole process, we've seen some indications, for example, that the EU might be willing to negotiate a lower tariff for U.S. autos. We might see some similar initiatives from other countries, especially if this does lead to any renegotiation of anything. So staying on the EU, if they were to agree to lower their tariff to match the US 2.5% tariff, do you expect the EU would apply the same tariff rate to imports from all other countries or not? And why or why not? And then just a corollary, we have a question from David Weller, a former USTR negotiator. Could the WTO be relevant to this process? Would the rates be reflected at all under the WTO tariff findings?
So I would expect the EU would absolutely apply whatever the reductions are across the board on an MFN basis, because that is their legal obligation. And the EU, like most countries outside of the United States, still does, I think, believe that there's some value based system and in the WTO, and obviously a bedrock principle of the WTO is MFN, most favored nation, that if you apply a tariff cut to one, you apply it to all. So I would expect that's what would happen. And in terms of David Weller's question, I mean, I've just put out a piece recently with Jos Poelen and Joan Hervé saying, if the WTO wants to get into this, and I think there is some real merit, there is a process under Article 28 of the GATT to actually sit down and engage in these negotiations. and to work a lot of these tariff reductions out in kind of a legal process in which there would be real negotiations with a number of the other key partners to try to figure out where you can come up with this kind of rough equivalent matches in terms of access to one another's markets and set tariffs under a legal, kind of process that gets negotiated. So again, far better from my end would be to do something that is still at least, in the realm of part of the WTO system. I mean, to me, that's one of the really kind of difficult aspects of this particular set of tariff proposals from the Trump administration is just that they are a wholesale violation of the bedrock principle of the WTO. So it is really causing a lot of consternation to undermine those principles. And we have to remember those were really important to a lot of countries, particularly the least developing and the smaller, developing countries. Because if we're just going to engage in a negotiation where I will only give you so much in tariff cuts if you will give me something in tariff cuts that are really valuable to me, for many of those small economies, they don't have anything that is significantly of value to the United States. I mean, we're never going to ship them enough of anything to make that, a fair exchange where I'll only lower my tariff if you'll lower yours, because they don't have enough bargaining chips, if you will. And it doesn't harm the United States to give some degree of market access and some degree of tariff certainty to a number of those countries. So, I would expect absolutely the EU and others would adhere to MFN. And again, the only question is whether and where the WTO gets brought into this.
So we have a question from the audience that I think is an interesting question, and maybe just a very short, like yes or no answer from each of the panelists. And the question is, does anyone on the panel believe that the tariffs are really just, setting aside China, really just meant to create negotiating leverage for either non-trade items or the trade issues that are identified, and that at the end of the day, these tariffs aren't actually going to come into place. And I should say that if you look again, I keep coming back to the notice from on Friday, it didn't list every single country in the world. I mean, it invited comments on every country in the world, but it actually had a concrete list of countries that they said were the focus. So could it be that the idea here is to try to create leverage with all these countries and negotiate it out, and the tariffs don't come into place? So who would like to go first? I select John.
I think it'll be both. Clearly, some of the tariff threats are negotiating tactics, and depending on the context and the issue, I think that's all can be appropriate, frankly. But I think the president has also described himself as tariff man, not tariff as leverage man, but tariff man, and tariffs is the most beautiful word in the English language. It's quite clear he believes that tariffs are a way to reindustrialize the American economy. And I don't believe he views tariffs merely as negotiating tactics. And, today I think there was an announcement of plans to follow through on the 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Those were threats, some perceived as threats, but I think the fact that they're going forward, despite some efforts by Canada and Mexico to address the problems, I think suggests that it's not mere a tactic. There's a commitment and a belief that tariffs are a useful tool for the American economy.
Mark, what's your view on the same question?
Yeah, I largely agree. I think they're going to go into effect. I think while China is still the largest problem, and long term over 4 years will be kind of the ultimate challenge, we have specific issues with almost all of our trading partners. The EU as a whole is not far behind China in terms of the trade deficit, and Mexico is not far behind the EU. So. And I think Canada, as an individual nation, is our number 6 biggest trade deficit. So we do have imbalances with our allies in addition to our adversaries, and I think there's a real desire to create balance on all of these fronts, addressing, our closest friends and allies first, and moving on to the biggest challenge in later days.
Jennifer,
Again, I don't know. I guess I'd been one of those people that had been really, really, really hoping the tariffs would not go on Canada and Mexico, in part because I personally think, A, they're illegal under IEEPA. I do not believe that the IEEPA gives the president the authority to impose these tariffs. But more importantly, the notion that, like 19 kilograms of fentanyl was the entire amount that was seized coming across the border between Canada and the United States in 2024, that for 19 kilograms of fentanyl, we are going to put hundreds of thousands of American jobs at risk. I mean, the auto industry alone is so integrated across Mexico, United States, and Canada that we really are at risk of hundreds of thousands of jobs and huge price increases across the board. For what? For the United States to threaten Canada over 19 kilograms of fentanyl. So again, to me, this is, if they go forward with this is a suggestion that the president is willing to use any amount of tariffs against anyone for any reason. And that's a really dangerous road to be on. A very, very dangerous road to be on. And it's not, to me, an indication that they're really looking for reciprocity.
so we had a question from Sharon Bomer-Lauritsen, former USTR ag negotiator. And I'm going to direct this to you, Mark. So if we accept that the tariffs are going to go in place, are they going to go in place on every single product coming from the country in question? So, example, are we really going to put tariffs on coffee, for example?
Did you say coffee?
I did, coffee, yes.
No. Not being part of these conversations, it's hard to say. I think you obviously saw with the rates that were proposed for Canada that they sort of made an exception with a lower rate for energy or oil from Canada. So I think there's room, and that's maybe one of the advantages of a policy like reciprocal tariffs and country by country considerations versus something like a global tariff, which has also been on the table, that there is an opportunity. We're not going to go through all 13,000 tariff lines for all 190 countries in the world. That's I don't think was ever on the table or ever going to be possible with the bandwidth of an organization like USTR. But I do think there's going to be room for recognizing there are legitimate comparative advantages, or there are certain goods, maybe even in critical minerals as well, where countries just have supplies of these raw materials or the right conditions for certain agricultural goods that the United States doesn't have. And I think there's room for some variation, I guess is what I would say.
Okay, thank you for that. So we had another interesting question from the audience, and it was to John and Jennifer. If you were still at USTR in the GC's office, what would you be advising the president? And I'm going to direct this first to you, John, because I know that you've argued in the past that the president could achieve his goal of more reciprocal trade relations by establishing tariff levels on a bilateral basis rather than a global basis. So what do you mean by that? Is that a series of bilateral negotiations or something else?
Well, I do think, as I said at the outset, and Jennifer said as well, I think the lack of reciprocity problem is not nearly as severe as the president suggests. That said, with certain countries, India, Brazil probably being at the top of the list, there are legitimate concerns about, with regard to non-reciprocity. Those should be addressed. And I do think, ideally, as Jennifer suggested, doing those sort of under Article 28 and sort of consistent with our WTO obligations, that would be ideal. But I have no problem with using ultimately the leverage of the U.S. market to get some progress on some of these languishing non-reciprocity issues. And it's appropriate to do that because the WTO, I think, has served many countries in the global economy, including the U.S., for the most part, quite well. But it's also true and clear to me, at least, that it doesn't seem to be a viable negotiating venue in the near term. So to the extent that you want to address some non-reciprocity, I think you're going to have to do it in a not through Geneva, but on a bilateral basis.
Jennifer, what's your reaction to that?
I'd only add, again, I'm not a fan of this, but if this is the road you want to go down, to me, the best way to do it is to initiate a whole series of Section 301 investigations by the countries that you're really worried about, so that you really do have an actual investigation that really shows the amount of the non-tariff barriers and where they are, et cetera. Maybe you also do some Section 301 investigations by sector. So again, that you're building an evidentiary base, et cetera. And the other part for me is that to me is what Section 301 was designed to do. That is the statute in which the Congress did delegate to the president tariff authority, in essence, to create leverage, to go after practices that are found to be unreasonable and create a burden on U.S. commerce. So that's the legal road to go down. If you're not going to go the Article 28 in Geneva route, if we're going to go a bilateral route, to me, it is collect the right information, have a full investigation, allow stakeholder input, have hearings, and do the process right. Partly because I think you will have much better chance of having an actual negotiation that results in change on your trading partner's part. And again, you have to go into them with the willingness to hear all sides in terms of what is the best, most likely, most viable outcome. But, again, that's what I would do. Again, that will take time. That will take a process. And so the issue right now is whether the president is willing to take the appropriate amount of time to make this an actual serious process, instead of just saying, oh, I'm going to pick a number out of the hat, 25%, and just start imposing tariffs.
Thanks. Simon, what's your reaction to that approach of addressing these issues?
You can go down this route, but I think the one thing which in Washington people overestimate is how much leverage the United States has here. The amount of leverage a country's exposure to the US market is only one factor that's relevant. The rate at which its exports are growing to third markets is also important. It's important to realize that at the current rate of export growth, China could replace all of its lost export sales to the United States, if everything was lost, in under 3 years. There's 70 countries who could replace all of their lost export sales to the United States in less than 12 months. Australia is one of them. And so when you factor these types of real world considerations in, then there are countries which are quite seriously exposed. The neighbors, of course, clearly are. But the subset of countries that you can actually exert leverage over is probably much smaller than many people in Washington realize. And that is because they haven't looked at the underlying trade flows involved. And I would urge you to do this in order to gauge where all this supposed leverage is going to come from.
So sorry, who's going to say something?
Just quickly, I would say on that, well, we're going to see what the backlash is in those countries when they're flooded with cheap foreign goods that the United States isn't absorbing anymore. And I think you've already seen a reaction across Europe in the automobile sector in the last few years on exactly that point.
So I think we have less than a minute to go. So just staying with you, Mark, as you started it up, you can finish it up. What do you think of Jennifer's approach of a series of Section 301 investigations?
Sure, I think there's a real chance that that's how this ends up playing out. I think the administration used all of these tools the first time around, and maybe they'll just ramp up and have even more Section 301 investigations. Another one that's thrown out there, was mentioned earlier on the call, is Section 338. My understanding is that hasn't really been used many times since it was enacted in 1930. But that has pretty broad discrimination, doesn't involve as much reporting. I'm sure a lot of tools are going to be on the table.
So we're right at the hour. I guess we're going to find out if Simon's comments about U.S. leverage are correct or not.
Really fascinating conversation, and we couldn't have asked for a more thorough view of this in the hour we had, which was not enough time. We've had a lot of webinars over the past 5 years. We have 25 questions that got asked on this one, 26. That's unusually high for our webinars, and a lot of them are quite detailed, and we did weave a lot of them in to the conversation. Great job by David pulling as many of those threads in. We will share those questions with our panelists so they can see what was asked, and there's some interesting thoughts that are shared there too. So thank you for all those questions. Thank you to our panel, the work that all of you have been doing on these issues. John, Jennifer, Simon, Mark, really appreciate your joining us. David, masterful job of moderating. Thank you very much. Look forward to this. Is going to be a busy time for all of us. We're going to be doing a lot of conversations about trade in the months to come. Look forward to seeing all of you on here again. Really appreciate it. Everybody take care, and we'll see you soon.
All right.